Okay, well, good morning again, and I am Jeff Peckrell from the Human Rights Working Group and Forum. Today's session is the first in March, which is Women's History Month. Last month was African American History Month, and this is Women's History Month. And to honor that, we have a presentation for you on women's rights. And Judy will be coming up Louise will introduce our speaker in just a minute. I'm just going to do a few things about Forum before we get started. And once again, I am Jeff Peckrell from the Human Rights Working Group and Forum. My co-chairs are, one of them is here, Melvin, over at the breakfast table, and I don't see Dolores yet, but she'll be here too. And I just want to tell you about some upcoming sessions. Next week we have Fred Glass, who is a labor rights leader and a historian of the labor rights movement in California. And I think that'll be a great session. He'll be giving us something about the history of labor rights in California and how people are organizing today. And the week after that, we have Calvin Welch. Calvin is a local organizer for affordable housing in San Francisco, and he will be presenting like a different perspective than the one we heard from Yimby back in January. So there'll be some interesting comments there. And the week after that, we have someone named Erwin Taranati, I believe. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he is from a group called Open Door Legal that provides legal services to folks that can't afford a high-priced lawyer but need it to defend their rights as tenants and things like that. Okay, so yeah, I think he lives in the Haight, maybe, or the Western Addition. Okay, so on your tables you'll see cards with pens. Those are for your questions, which will take mostly at the end. I will help out by collecting those cards towards the end of our speaker's talk, and we'll do the questions mostly at the end, and that Q&A session begins around 10:15 or 10:30. So our speaker will wrap up her speech by then. Okay, now I'd like to do our Ohlone land recognition. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, gratefully acknowledge that we are located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples who inhabited what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with all of nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to Mother Earth. I have one more statement to read, and this is kind of about our intentions for Forum, how we gather together and take in the information from our speakers and talk about it. So the intention of this presentation is to hear about various issues in our world today and provide a space where many ideas can be heard and discussed in an atmosphere of dignity and respect for all participants. Therefore, here are our expectations for this conversation. Please don't use language which may be interpreted as demeaning to the speaker, the audience, or other groups. Do participate by raising your hand to be recognized and identify yourself by name, or there are cards available for you to write a brief description or question. Listen and respect to other points of view. Once you have spoken, please let others have a chance to speak, and if there is time, you may be called upon to speak again. Okay. Finally, we are not having Zoom participants today, so thank you all for being brave enough to come out in the rain. It is being recorded, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, so that if you have friends that didn't make it today that you think would like to hear our speakers talk, you can forward them the link to the YouTube channel, which will come out as an email tomorrow or on Tuesday. All right, so with that, I'd like to introduce Louise, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
I'm Louise, and I'm one of the Women's Rights Group's members. And we've invited Barbara Nielsen today, who is with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, to come and speak to us. Guess the weather scared a few of us off, understandable. But luckily it's recorded. So Barbara Nielsen, a San Franciscan, has been aware of and active in women's and peace matters involving the United Nations for several decades, primarily through her membership and activism in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom since 1971 to the present. She is active in what they call, I think they pronounce it WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, locally, has served in several member-elected roles, and including current service as the elected National Treasurer Finance Committee Chair. Also, a program-based committee leadership role focusing on the UN. She has been a member of the U.S. delegations to Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, International Congress meetings, and also an official delegate of WILPF at several of the annual meetings of the UN's Commission on the Status of Women held in New York City. United Nations began celebrating International Women's Day in 1975, which had been proclaimed the International Women's Year, and has been so celebrated since 1977. Barbara's perspective on the UN's iteration of International Women's Day established by the UN as March 8th will be to focus on aspects of the various UN mechanisms for member status to support women. So I'd like to welcome Barbara up here, and we might need a little adjustment with the mic. And thank you for coming.
Thank you to everyone who is here and for taking this time to be with us and be with me. As has been said, I am a member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We began in 1915 in The Hague in the Netherlands when many members from the many women from the United States took a boat, and there were members in this nascent group in Europe who had been kindred spirits and writing back and forth. And they met at The Hague, and they sought audiences with leaders of the belligerent nations during World War I, and went to them to say, war has never been the answer. War isn't the answer today. War is never going to be the answer. Please come sit at peace tables and negotiate a peace. And those well-known men looked at these upstart women and said, well, thank you for your time, ladies, but we're going to do what we want to do. And they've been doing that with regard to war ever since. The WILPF women did not give up. We later became WILPF. They wound up going to the countries where the belligerents were from and sought and received audiences from their governments and received basically the same response. People thought that they were crazy. They probably didn't say it like that, but that's really what it came down to. And so there's been a band in the thousands of women around the world ever since who sometimes are thought of as being crazy, who don't really care about that, but who continue to work for peace. Because as we are seeing, even today, to open up any form of media, you will see that war has never been the answer, war is not the answer, and war will not be the answer, whether it be in Gaza or Ukraine or in Yemen or in Mexico or in the United States. And we have stood by our principles and policies along those lines. When I was called by Louise to ask if we in Women's International League, so we're headquartered in Geneva, and we have what's called sections, groups in countries, about 40 of them around the world. And in the United States, we have a few thousand members around the United States. The San Francisco branch, we don't call them chapters, has been around since about 1923 continuously, and we have one in the East Bay as well, and we meet together for program-related materials. We work hard to get the word out about alternatives to nuclear weapons, to conventional weapons, to waging war as much as we possibly can. And so when Louise called and said that you all would like a speaker on International Women's Day, on the subject of International Women's Day, I said, well, as you know, I'm with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I would be very glad to speak on this and talk about us and why we think that waging peace is, in the short and long run, more effective than waging war, and how that can fit into International Women's Day. Louise said, sure. I will tell you that in the 1970s, when I first heard about the UN's establishment of an International Women's Day, I was horrified. I was like, what do these people think of, that all these men think of, that they have International Man's Day 365 days a year, and that women are going to be satisfied with one day a year being called International Women's Day? I mean, and there are lots of international blank days at the UN for different things. And to some degree, I think everybody who's had one of those days or who has one of those days probably feels like some of us do, which is it would be really nice for us to be valued on an equal basis in equity and acknowledging our diversity in the same way that the men who run the UN are acknowledged. And one of the things that I discovered over the years of my involvement, not only in Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which we do pronounce WILF, it's sort of all at the end, those consonants sort of all go together, is that the UN, I had thought as a kid and in my early adult years, I had thought of the UN as a bunch of dignitaries in waistcoats standing around and being diplomatic to one another and being otherwise totally useless. And the first time I was able to go to the UN for what's called the Commission on the Status of Women annual meetings, this year is the 68th, I discovered that my view of the UN was so incredibly wrong as to be almost mythical and fantastical. The first time I went into a meeting and listened to a panel presentation and realized that in the room I was in, which was about a quarter of this size, there were maybe 30 of us there. There were two men who represented countries that at home were killing each other. And that's their daily life in their home countries, is that their countries are trying to kill the populations of each other's countries. And yet each of those countries has diplomatic relations at the UN, and they are working their darndest to come to negotiated peace in one way or another. I mean, some countries, the United States is one of them that comes to mind, tends to play games with the UN and think it can manipulate the UN. But I think that if you study the UN, or just even take a closer look than most of us do, you will see that it's terrific that the UN declared March 8th as International Women's Day, and that women who like to celebrate those kinds of things can celebrate it. But to me, it's even more interesting and more useful to realize that that same organization has thousands of people on staff in delegations from countries which are called member states, and among the thousands of us who are civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations who have what's called consultative status at the UN, that we're all working together in many ways 24/7 around the world to try to find ways to build a just peace. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about the fact that we also have an International Women's Day declared by the UN. Historically, it would appear that around the 1900s, 1910s, there were various places that were, countries that were suggesting International Women's Day. Russia was doing it. Some of the European countries were talking about it. The United States was talking about National Women's Day. And it was all over the map in at different dates. Some people say that it was probably the socialists or the communists who started it as a way to move a political agenda. But whatever, it started catching hold, and from around 1910 or 11. And as the decades went on, again, sporadic, not exactly consistent, every single place, but it gave women locally and even nationally and other people a way to suggest that perhaps women were going to be given value by the society in which they lived. I think my personal feeling is it's been honored more in the breach than in the execution, because you have celebrations on one day and then going back to where's my laundry on the next. And women serving in subservient roles very often in their households, for instance, no matter what they may do to make a living out in the workplace. But nonetheless, consciousness raising, in my experience, is not a sure thing constantly going forward. It's kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So it gives us an opportunity to have a focal point. And I think as long as we don't let people with whom we work, interact, engage in activism, think that celebrating a single day is the only thing that's necessary, it's a cool thing to have. The UN not only proclaimed it in the 1970s, the UN proclaimed 1975 as the Year of the Woman, and they proclaimed a Decade of the Woman as well, and had all sorts of special events. One of them was where I first saw a cardboard poster for International Women's Day that set me screaming home, saying, how dare they try to give me 1 day a year only. But I've calmed down a little since then. What I discovered, as I started to say, going back to the UN, our U.S. section, being in the U.S. with the United Nations General Assembly building and complex in the United States in New York City, the Commission on the Status of Women meets every year in New York City in the first 2 weeks in March, and has a lot of policy stuff going on. And member states and bigger delegations, if you are a civil society organization such as us or the UNA or many churches, you can apply for and be granted consultative status with the UN, which allows your organization to participate officially as a CSO in consultative status and participate in the rulemaking and decision-making processes and deliberations. And also for the CSW, which is the single largest meeting that the UN has. There are about 10,000 people who come from around the world and descend upon the east side of New York for the CSW meetings. First time I went, as I said, when I was in a room and I saw these 2 guys from neighboring countries who at home were killing each other, I had a flash of clarity that was almost blinding, that if anything is going to work, this kind of a process is where it has to happen. Because everybody comes there, in theory anyway, and often in reality, with the idea of this has to work. We really don't have very many other options, if any. And interestingly enough, it often does. It's not perfect. It is not a panacea, but it's the best thing we've got, and it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Men and women of good cheer and diligent workers and policy wonks and political people and a whole panoply of people from governments and from civil society come to the CSW, and there are panels. The NGOs have an organization of NGOs, and they're allowed to present panels as side events. The member states are allowed to present panels and events, and the UN staff presents panels and events all over New York, not only in the General Assembly buildings. And people go to them and meet people and exchange business cards and go away and try to figure out how best to fix the wrongs that exist still in the world. And to me, the UN's having brought to the attention of a lot of people by putting its imprimatur on an International Women's Day of March 8th is the doorway into letting people know that there's a whole bunch more behind that door at the UN that is ours for the taking, ours meaning the people in the United States, for wanting to learn more. And the CSW, in order to be able to go to events on the General Assembly campus, you have to have a grounds pass, and there's a whole process about being able to make that happen, and you have to have consultative status if you're a civil society organization. However, there are so many panels and presentations that go on, especially during the first of the 2 weeks. That's when most people come, like us, like Women's International League. So many events happening that they can't possibly fit in the General Assembly behind the guards and the security checks. And so they're held in buildings all over Midtown Manhattan. So the Salvation Army building has a bunch of them, the Armenian Center has a bunch of them. Any place that has a big enough set of rooms has events going on, and you can go to them if they're not on the General Assembly land without having a grounds pass and being credentialed. How does this work? The CSW has a priority theme and a review theme every year. And last year it was technology. It was really very interesting. It changes every year. You can go online and see. There's now an organization that's been around since about 2010 called UN Women, and it is the organization that's tasked with making sure the stuff that comes out of the Commission on the Status of Women gets done and gets circulated to the right people, and that people know about it, and that civil society knows about it, and that things aren't just either under glass or behind closed doors. The way the positiveness of the process of the UN works is for people to know about it. And the UN works hard on things like conventions. There are two major agendas for women at the UN. One is called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which came out of a UN Security Council resolution called 1325, and its progeny. There are a bunch of resolutions that followed it. And that has to do with, just as it says, women, peace, and security. And having programs for women, having a national action plan for women, making priorities that are not war priorities, that take into account women as when we're 94.1 to we're a fraction of a point less than 50% of the population, men being on the other side of that equation, less than 1% difference. And yet so many things that are done in so many organizations, governmental and non-governmental, are focused on the male part of things. And the CSW helps make about 10,000 people a year be very much aware that there's more to just the male side of things. People come, they want to make presentations on issues of concerns, food sovereignty, violence against women, domestic violence against women, human trafficking, violence against widows, immolation, forced immolation by widows, lots and lots of different things, including men there. And several years ago, I met a group of men from Sweden, and they were there, and they had I don't remember the name of their organization anymore, but basically it was Men for Women. And they had organized, these guys were young, but it was like their fathers had organized this effort in recognition of the fact that women can't do it all ourselves. And if you think about it, any group that has been marginalized will have a lot better chance of unmarginalizing themselves if they have a help from people on the other side of the equation. And those are all things that you can learn about how and why the UN gives us hope that we don't have to live in a world that is populated by the number 42s of the White House and their progeny. That it can be, we can have people in authority around the world and even in our communities that can help us help them make life better for everybody. Helping women doesn't only help women, as all of us in this room, I'm sure, know. But when you start to marginalize a group, it draws everybody down as well, even though it might not seem that way. I'm going to stop for a moment to get a sense of people and to also move my paper. The other big program that is at the UN, and when I say at the UN, it is not only at the UN. It's a lot of civil society organizations work with people in the UN and work at home and work with their governments. The Women, Peace, and Security Agenda under Security Council 1325 is designed to help governments make different priorities for how they run their governments, so that instead of having the priority always be weapons of mass destruction and things that are exploitative of natural resources in addition to human resources, that they change the lens in their viewing so that they can make better choices for sustainability on multiple levels. And one of the things that goes on a scheduled basis is something called a National Action Plan. And several years ago, WILF US was able to participate in a national action plan that the United States was drafting for itself. And I was not one of the people involved in it. I knew several who were. And the idea is, and these are periodic, we're on a cycle right now. Our current National Action Plan is ending in 2024, and we need to have a new one. Again, these are things that most of us in the United States don't know about. It's not that nobody will let you know about it. It's sort of you have to know about it in order to ask about it. And again, it's another reason to be glad that we have International Women's Day to use as a springboard to start conversations about some of these other more concrete things that are happening in the UN and happening locally, to be able to make our local communities better. A really good example is how many of you know that San Francisco has a commission and a department on the status of women? Yeah. One reason we do is because of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW. And CEDAW is the other big program at the UN that is meant to be embraced in local communities. San Francisco was the first city and county to set up a commission on the status of women. Los Angeles followed almost immediately. And we not only have the commission, which is an appointed commission, but we also have a department, which is the administrative side running things. And they're very busy in San Francisco. They've been around a long time. They do some very interesting work. I think you can get on their mailing list if you're not already. And the idea is to get more commissions on the status of women in communities so that members of the community can go locally to say, hey, we have situations in our community that are not promoting equity for women, or that are showing discrimination against women, or that are showing intolerance towards women in various ways, and dealing with those kinds of issues at the local level. In many ways, if you didn't know that that existed, I would think you might feel the same way I did when I first discovered its existence. I was stunned. It's like part of our local government has this? I mean, that's a very cool thing. And not a lot of governments do in the United States, but that's something that people can work on in their local communities in order to make it happen. Sam, I'm going to find something. Hold on a second. I apologize. I thought I had this marked better, but it should be here. We have, so CEDAW has to be, CEDAW is like the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a lot like, you may have heard of this little treaty that some of us have been working on called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. The TPNW has been enacted and it's in force in the United Nations. And of course, the nuclear weapons countries have not supported it, but it exists. And when a treaty goes through the United Nations process, there are two things that have to happen. First is it has to be signed by the appropriate people in the country signing, and then for it to be binding on that country, it has to be ratified. And I apologize if you all know this already, but some people don't. So the United States has signed CEDAW. It did a long time ago, but it refuses to ratify it. The Senate refuses to ratify it. That means that we don't have to be accountable because we didn't ratify it. At least that's what the people in the Senate who aren't signing it, that's the attitude that they're copying to. Oh, well, no. Yeah, we signed it. Yeah, well, how come we're not abiding by it? Oh, well, we didn't ratify it. Well, why are you being such a smartass about this? Why not? Well, it would be. It's really a big. There's some real problems there, and it's like when I was a kid and my parents said, "Oh, you wouldn't understand." It's like, well, you have two choices: you're going to educate me, or you're going to continue to treat me like a total idiot. And in the case of people in our government at the federal level, my attitude is usually, who do you think you're talking to? A complete idiot? Because the idea is preposterous. Morally, we should be, we're bound to this regardless. And of course, the Senate says, well, morals have nothing to do with what we do in our house. And sometimes I think we'd probably agree with them. But in terms of the kind of government we'd like to see being engaged in on our behalf, I should think we'd all be very concerned that we get at least a ballpark bottom line of what is the consensus on morality. And so don't tell me, Congress, that you're thinking of making a day of women in the United States if you're not willing to put your money where your mouth is and ratify CEDAW. I mean, that's very straightforward. And it's also in a vacuum, I understand. There are lots of other things going on. But I think most of us would agree when you tear away the howevers and you move away the curtain that the wizard has, there's a very large boombox there that gives a message to many people in the United States that basically says, oh, don't worry your pretty little heads about this. That's what our job is, and we'll take care of it. And I think we can see nuclear power, nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, water rights, water damage, riparian damage, air quality damage, over and over and over again. No, they're not doing what they say they're doing. They're doing a lot of window dressing. And some of these conventions that are in the United Nations, CEDAW is one of them, is fairly straightforward, are really good examples to be able to talk to your friends about, talk to your family about, look into, to say, something, this isn't as complicated as I was led to believe. I mean, some of this stuff is really very straightforward. And I come back once again, International Women's Day. If that can get us started talking about some of this other stuff and the possibilities that could exist if we were able to put pressure on our representatives to say, you need to give more authority to the people who are representing us in the UN, and you need to pay more attention to the UN. What do you mean you're vetoing a ceasefire? How can we let someone veto a ceasefire when the reason they are is because they have friends giving them money for their campaign contributions who are making money on the weapons that are being sold? Yes, thank you. Those are the things that I think about when I thought about International Women's Day, when Louise asked me if I would talk about it, or if we would talk about it. She didn't know I was going to be the one talking about it. There's one other aspect that I'd like to raise in this, even though it's not about the Commission on the Status of Women. We have 5 treaties in the UN. that are treaties on weapons of mass destruction. And all five of them are based on humanitarian grounds. Now, does that sound weird? Does that sound like anything that we would be interested in? Here we go. Does that sound like it matters? Yeah. The five treaties are, the oldest one was 1975, and that was biological weapons. Then in 97, we had chemical weapons. Then in 99, we had landmines, and that's called the Ottawa Treaty, and it was handled a little differently than some of the others. Then in biological, chemical, landmines. Then in 2010, it was cluster bombs. And then in 2021, a miraculous thing happened. After 10 years of, we have a group out of our international office, but they're based in New York, that is called Reaching Critical Will, and an amazing woman named Ray Atchison runs it. Ray works tirelessly. She's an amazing young woman, but she worked even more tirelessly directly and with an organization that goes by the initials ICAN, International Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons. For 10 years, she and a whole bunch of other primarily women's, but not all, organizations worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and got a treaty into the UN that's called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And now there already is a treaty against nuclear weapons. It's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Anybody hear of it? Probably. Yeah. What is that treaty? Well, I think of it as shiny hubcaps. I promise that I won't build more than X new weapons with shiny chrome hubcaps if you promise the same thing. Not I won't build them at all, not I'll delete some. It's I'll only build X of these brand new, super duper, new model, chrome hubcap, shiny nuclear weapons. Well, what does that do? It doesn't mean that you're eliminating your existing ones. I don't think they have a shelf life. It just means you're adding to it. Well, the Treaty on the Prohibition Against Nuclear Weapons says we're not going to build any more, and we're going to get rid of the ones that we have. And the treaty is based on the fact that on humanitarian grounds, it's inhumane to have nuclear weapons. It was inhumane to have biological weapons. Granted, this isn't perfect. There are still some of all these floating around. That's not my point. It's inhumane to have chemical weapons. It's inhumane to have landmines, and it's inhumane to have cluster bombs, let alone use them. And do you know the miraculous thing that happened back in 2017 when this started in earnest and they started collecting signatures? Countries signed on. And countries not only signed on to the TPNW, but they signed and they ratified. And we managed to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on humanitarian grounds ratified in the United Nations. People said it couldn't be done, but it exists. And I think of that every time I think of International Women's Day, because women made that possible. Oh, sure, there were lots of really great guys doing it too. But women said, what are you doing to my children? What are you doing to our grandchildren? What are you doing to the land that is supposed to feed us? What are you doing to the environment that's supposed to allow us a hospitable and nurturing air and planet to live on? We can't do any of those things if we have nuclear weapons or cluster bombs or chemical weapons or biological weapons or landmines. And it's inhumane. Well, you know something? Because of the United Nations and the fact that we have an International Women's Day, which is with a lot of women working in the UN and in civil society, I must tell you, to go to the CSW meetings, which I've been fortunate enough to do with WILP US for several years over a period of time, it's one of the most extraordinary things ever. You get a sense of, oh my God, we really could do anything. Are there men there? Yes. Do we need men? You better believe it. I love men. I've loved many men, actually, well, several. But the presence of women making decisions, the presence of women listening and deliberating, the presence of women, because women count just as much as men, is a huge message that is sent to every single young woman or man who goes to the CSW every year. I cannot encourage you enough, if you have an opportunity ever in March and you're in New York City, to go. If you're a member of a civil society organization that has consultative status, please consider looking into going in an upcoming year. It is a mind-altering experience or life-altering experience, and comes back down once again to why I think it's a fantastic thing that the UN decided to establish International Women's Day on March 8th. I thank you very much for having me here, and I hope that I have given you helpful information and excited you a little about some things.
Thank you so much. I think we have more questions, which I'll collect in just a minute here, but I have a couple already. The most difficult thing I see for women is internalizing the abuse we've received from the patriarchy. Any comment?
Is
internalizing the abuse we've received from the patriarchy.
If in general, my response personally has been to decide I need to devote my time to things that are more productive and to recognize where it's coming from. I mean, I'm not talking about I was put into the hospital by somebody being abusive. I mean, that needs to be rectified. But the patriarchy, I remember as a girl going into a room and people looking at me asking, why are you there? And the people who were doing it were men. I don't see that very often anymore.
Do you know if the Unitarian Universalists have contributor status at the UN?
It's consultative status, and I think you probably do. What you can do is go to Chrome and type in consultative status at the UN and put in the name. And I apologize that I don't off the top of my head know, but I'd really think that you guys do.
What is the best way to measure or determine if we have women's rights or progress on women's rights?
Oh. I guess I would ask a question back. In what milieu are you talking about?
Whoever asked the question would like to add to that? What context? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think in San Francisco we live in a paradise, a fool's paradise sometimes, but please give me a government that I can understand. And I'm not talking about anybody in particular. But I think it depends. In San Francisco, I think we live in a paradise. I think women are heard in San Francisco more. I think women are listened to in San Francisco more, perhaps even in California, than in many other places in the United States. Is it nirvana? No. But we do have a place on the dais.
Here's my question. Well, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 things that men can do to show their allyship for the women's rights agenda that you've been talking about here?
That's a great question, and I could have said more about it. Besides being supportive and taking a deep breath to see how much we do know before making an assumption that we don't, which some people do. And that's not limited to gender, actually. We had a class in the CSW student practicum, and that had one fellow in it. And I think there were like 10 young women. They were all in school. And they had lots of conversations along those lines. And one of the things that he talked about was making the assumption that we can all do whatever we want to, and being willing to say out loud when I can't do it, he would say, but also saying, being not unafraid of saying, is there anything I can do? And making clear that it wasn't that we thought you couldn't, that you were dumb, as much as you have to build a level of trust before you really can ask, how can I help in certain ways? And understanding that trust needs to be there, I think helps. I hope that made sense. I was just thinking of someone I know, and yeah.
Hi, Barbara. I'm Barbara also, and I am a member of WILF San Francisco. And I thank you for your presentation today. And it brought up a few questions that come from a certain insider knowledge of San Francisco Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So, starting out with, the United Nations was founded in San Francisco. Has WILF San Francisco been able to move beyond the mammoth bureaucracy you have talked about involved in the United Nations? That's the first part of my question.
Has San Francisco WILF? We're not directly involved in the UN bureaucracy. We have issues in WILF with the national leadership and people not understanding. We're a membership nonprofit. Our stakeholders are our members, so the stakeholders own the corporation. And that's something that some people in our leadership don't grasp the concept of very well.
Thank you. Secondly, WILF International is working in the past couple of years diligently in Africa and African nations. Is WILF International's work part of UN actions?
WILF International, which is headquartered in Geneva, communicates with people at the UN in various offices. But most of the work that is done by International WILF, which we call it the Secretariat, we have a General Secretary, most of the work that has been done trying to get new sections in African countries has come from working with leadership in existing sections and working with people who know people in countries where we don't have anybody to try to start new. So in some ways, it's a lot like trying to start a new branch in the United States. You find you think it's a logical place where there might be some people who are like-minded, and you try to find people you know who know people there, and you start talking with them to see, can we do any grassroots membership building? But we don't do that for WILF with UN contacts.
Well, I had also a question on the status of women in the Commission on the Status of Women in San Francisco, and if that is even known to San Francisco WILF. But what I want to say is the gist of all of this is I think that we're really caught up in bureaucracy here, big time, both in the United Nations and internationally. That's my question.
Thank you. We in San Francisco WILF don't usually talk about the Commission on the Status of Women. We also have a human rights coalition in San Francisco that's very active that I tend to, when I can, go to their annual meetings and symposia. As you know, Barbara, we have some WILF members who have been active in various aspects of San Francisco government on issues that affect us. The using military weapons for police weapons is an example where we've been monitoring and reporting back. There's a lot out there to focus on, and actually a rich environment to focus on. And we miss a lot of stuff, I think. Not because we're bad, but because we're a small group and we're older. And that's something that is affecting WILF across the United States, but not only us, where younger people having kids, they're working, they're having kids, dealing with a peace organization isn't high on their priorities because the peace process seems so distant and removed. And one of the things that an organization like ours has to do is to figure out a way to be able to create niches for people to join and to be able to do things that can make a difference on certain levels that don't take up thousands of hours of time. And we haven't been as creative in doing that as we could. We are in the process, we've been given a large grant by a member who wants us to have a strong senior staff person, like an executive director. And maybe that will help us in coming up with answers to some of these questions. Those are very good questions, Barbara.
You mentioned police militarization. So for anyone who wasn't here last week, that was the topic we had last week, and our speaker, John Lindsay Poland, had some specific ideas for how people can get involved on that particular issue. Just follow up with me afterwards if you didn't hear about that. Next question, what is the difference between signing and ratifying in the U.S. Senate? What power does the ratification of humanitarian treaties have?
Okay, so countries, there's a two-step process to many treaties, and the ones I've been talking about fell to that. In order to indicate that in order to give a public indication that you are intending to move forward towards ratifying a treaty, you have to sign it. Some countries, and you come to New York and do that, by the way. That's not done by a Zoom or with an Adobe Acrobat PDF maker. So you have to have it signed on behalf of the country. Some countries on some of these treaties signed and ratified the same day. Some countries said, I'll sign, like us in CEDAW. We signed and then we didn't do squat for years and years and years. There's no time limit. And if we ever get our Senate to say yes, then they'll ratify. Ratifying means that your country has not only signed, but it's binding itself to be bound by the treaty's terms. Now, is that honored in the breach a lot? Sure. But that's the idea behind it. And it's a bigger deal to screw over a treaty when you ratified it than it is when you've only signed it. That's why the United States sort of thumbs its nose at the CEDAW treaty. Oh, we signed it. But we didn't ratify it yet. Does that make sense?
When and how do the branches of your organization in San Francisco and the East Bay have meetings? Are they done on Zoom? What is your contact information? Is there a handout and a sign up, by the way, at the outside at the table?
Betty, I think Betty Traynor, raising her hand, yes, there's Betty Traynor, a longtime Wealth member of San Francisco.
Thank you.
Let me just go back to one thing here. I forgot to read this. This is about ratifying or not ratifying, and CEDAW. The United States is one of only 6 UN member states, which are countries, that have not ratified CEDAW. Any guesses who the other 5 are? I'll tell you. Iran, Palau, middle of the Pacific, Somalia, Sudan, and Tonga. So they have been unwilling to say that they think all forms of discrimination against women should be eliminated. But all the other countries who are member states have. So think about what some of those countries are. Are you surprised? They ratified it. Go ahead.
DEI is under attack, mainly being removed from colleges to exclude women as well. What is your view of this sudden change, and what should we do about it? And define DEI for those who don't know. Diversity initiatives.
Diversity, equity, and inclusivity. I think actually this is nothing very new. I grew up before affirmative action. Well, many of us may have grown up before affirmative action, which was a hideously dirty word for all sorts of reasons, and in schools in particular. And I only had to deal with the sex side of it. I didn't have to deal with the race side of it. But the epithets that were spewed out from mostly white males who thought that they who had almost an unfettered entitlement was huge and filled with vitriol. So now we have a new term, DEI, which actually I like, and lots of articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about it. And the same people who are a lot of the same people who are deniers about other things are denying that anybody needs any help or even any kind of level playing field, because it's already level. And so to introduce something like diversity, equity, and inclusivity into curricula or into any way in any educational system is, we would have called it communist, or they would have called it communistic years ago. They have new names for it now. It's anti-American. But is equity under attack? Yes, it is. Is it new? That's not new at all, unfortunately. There may have been a diminution for a while, or it wasn't talked about very much. But with social media now, you can get a spike on a topic very quickly, depending on how social media is manipulated for different positions.
Are there any theater companies that are doing programming that supports the women's rights agenda? If I phrased your question fairly? That you would like to call out and sort of suggest that we support?
I am going to offer a blanket apology. I don't go out to theater anymore. I haven't for a while since I have vision issues. I do not see well at night, so I just don't know. The usual suspects who have been out supporting causes all along, all of those who are still around, I'm sure are doing excellent jobs, but I just don't know.
Okay. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, how are they connected to the United Nations and the needs of women?
Well, they're both they're arms of the United Nations, and I was actually in the building with in The Hague with one of them. They're there. The UN tries to do a lot of things through the Security Council and General Assembly, but it is a tribunal. Both of those courts are tribunals, and they do exist. And to the extent that women's issues need to be adjudicated on an international level, that would be where the issue, that would most likely be where the issue would go if it could not be handled through the General Assembly or the Security Council, or negotiations between parties.
Do you have any other questions? I think we may have finished our... Oh, Louise, please.
Thank you. Sure. I was just going to ask, what is the percentage of members below 40 years old in your organization in the Bay Area?
In the Bay Area, I would guess in single digits right now. It's that low. COVID had a lot to do with that. We have lost members, not from COVID, but we have lost members who were older and who just died. And we have not actively gone out to recruit younger members, in part because of COVID, and in part, I think, because we're still trying to figure out what is the best, what would be the best draw, and do we have the resources to be able to do it locally. And our national organization is going through asking these same kinds of questions. For a while it was, how do we stop our existing members from from ceasing their dues, because we are a dues-based organization. And some of that had to do with the economy and also COVID. So I'd like to be able to tell you we have a new membership campaign and all sorts of really wonderful things, but the invitation to do this came now, and we haven't yet begun doing that other stuff that needs to be done. So it's on our table, it's on our plates. Thank you for asking, it's a good question. And if you'd like to help, we'd certainly love to accept any help we could get.
Barbara, I wanted to add to that, though. We do have a group it's actually in the East Bay, and we would like to start here, where young people under 40 are involved, which is called Beyond Enlisting.
You're right, I'm sorry, Nan. Betty, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, so they actually have a wonderful website, and they go to high schools, primarily in Oakland and Berkeley, and they're talking to young people, and they have... It's not you or
myself talking, it's young men and women who were in the military and telling them what is it really like. And I think it's just remarkable what they're doing. They're getting a lot of interest in Oakland to go to the different high schools and talking to people about this. So I highly recommend you check into that. And these are mainly people under 40. So, yeah, beyond enlisted.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, Betty.
We do have to wrap up, but I'll give one more question. Yes? To Meg? Did you have a question? No? She just answered. Oh, okay. Okay. So she has answered that question. There are no other questions. We will wrap up now and thank Barbara for her excellent talk today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you found the information useful and inspiring.
I strongly believe that if women were in more positions of power, there would be so many fewer problems in the world today. So we need to totally uplift the voices of women. As we wrap up, I want to invite you all back to this space at 12:30. We have global, is it here, Bruce? Yeah, we have global conversations today. Today's topic is called Considering the Alternatives. 4 organizations present their visions for a better world for humanity. So this should be a really interesting session. It's kind of like a setup of 3 or 4 different perspectives and 4 different ones. Come back for that. And lunch, right? Yes. And of course, Forum next Sunday. We'll be back here and we have a great talk for you on California labor history. So we hope to see you back next week. And I believe that's it. We'll include, when the email comes out with the recording of today's session, we'll try to include the information about your next meeting and the contact information too, so if anybody who wants to get involved in WILF can do so.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you again.